Hi students, this is week number 12. It's hard to believe it's the last lecture and you'll be working on your class presentations over the next week or two. Sometimes at this point we have a week left in the semester, sometimes we have 2 weeks left. So you'll have to check the syllabus to see when your final assignment is actually due. But we'll talk more about that at the end of the class. So today's lecture topics are the fabric industry and professional practices, which I'm not going to spend too much time on those. I'm going to do more of a review of what we have covered over the semester, just hitting some of the highlights for you as a good review of what we have covered. Of course, that had absolutely nothing to do with the interior design industry, but the word mill can be confusing, and sometimes a mill is both a manufacturer and a wholesaler and possibly a retailer. So don't be confused by that. Generally, a mill is where something is manufactured, but it can sometimes be used to represent a retailer, as it is in this instance in Utah Woolen Mills. Okay, so just a quick review of the fabric industry that we talked about in our first lecture. Samuel Slater smuggled precious textiles and machinery designs into America in the late 18th century. We talked about that early on. Then Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin, and voila, the American textile industry was born. And then in Europe at about this same time, we talked about Joseph J. M. Jacquard. He was inventing a loom that could be controlled by punch cards. Remember, we talked about that being the beginnings of the computer industry back in the 1800s. And then elaborate intricate patterns could then be woven. And then a few years later, the first American power loom was built, and all operations from the opening of the cotton bales from the south to the finishing of the woven cloth were mechanized and all under one roof for the first time, which really sped things up and brought the price down. And by 1860, more people were employed in the textile mills than in any other American industry. So number 2 from our chart, textile manufacturing really has not changed that much since 1860, except of course their technological advances have increased the speed, efficiency, cleanliness. But cloth today remains one of man's basic needs and will always need to be spun from fiber and woven or knitted into cloth. So textile manufacturers today are very, very diverse. There are huge modern plants and smaller plants that have not changed much in decades. Number 3, textiles are produced in almost every country, aren't they? Some countries produce exclusively for their own use, but most textiles are exported around the world. Today, some fabric is produced in technologically advanced mills, but in many countries it's still hand-woven on simple looms as it was centuries ago. And if you'll recall, I showed you throughout the semester examples of some of the textiles that I've created around the world, some of which were handmade and others that were done on looms, others that were done in mills. We talked about the aesthetics or the characteristics of fabric: color, light, texture, pattern, and market appropriateness. We talked about that in the first half of the class, I think in lesson number 2. So under these 5 characteristics, let's kind of look at some of these aesthetics or characteristics of fabric. First of all, pattern. Motifs, of course, and their arrangement constitute pattern. Pattern is often confused with repeat. And I showed you how to measure repeat on fabric, something that's very important for you to understand. Pattern is generally continuous, unless it's like a pattern in number 4, which is a fabric that is rarely produced without repeat. And I showed you some examples of those in batiks that are hand dyed, so they don't necessarily, or they definitely don't have the same repeat that most fabrics generally have. We talked about texture. It's inseparable from fabric. The texture is derived from the Latin word textere, meaning to weave. We talked about how you can hear texture. If I was to run my fingernails across the fabric that you see on this slide, you could actually hear the texture created by my fingernails rubbing against it. It's determined by fiber content, density, weave, other factors. And we looked at some samples of fabrics with different textures. So I think that's a fairly easy concept to understand, one of the characteristics. Light and lighting. Color itself is determined by light. If there's no light on the fabric, we certainly can't enjoy its color. Changes in light seldom affect the relationships between the colors. And I wanted to stress when we had this lecture that the fabrics have to be chosen in the actual light they're going to be used. So if a client chooses a fabric in a store somewhere, you need to look at that fabric in her home or in the commercial space where it's going to be used. End users are sophisticated. They're aware of multiple alternatives. You have to defer to what they think is wonderful more so than what you think is wonderful. And also on light, we did a little exercise, I believe, where we shone a little light or a flashlight on our pants and showed how the color that was hidden under the desk and hidden from the light looked very different from the fabric that was in the light. So color is definitely determined by light. Color, we just love color. We have to realize that fabric is first chosen for its color. That's what's going to draw you or your clients to color. Many of you have already taken color theory here at Ensign College. So before we choose texture or pattern, we always choose color, but we have to agree with clients as they may see color differently. I may or may not have mentioned that once I was looking at a sunset with my daughter, and she was describing the beautiful colors that she saw, and they were very, very different than the colors that I chose. So we see color differently, and remember, you often have to refer to what your client thinks is a more appealing color than what you think is an appealing color. Color never appears flat, so again, the client must find the color pleasing. Color has culturally devised connotations. In our country, we think of black kind of referring to death and white for weddings, but that's not true in all places, is it? In some countries, white actually represents death and mourning, so you kind of have to be sensitive to the different cultural connotations. Perils of using white and beige, they can both be in the cool spectrum or the warm spectrum, but when they're reused, remember that the more neutral a scheme, the more noticeable the other details become. So just, one of the pitfalls that one has to watch out for. We talked about market appropriateness, how personal taste primarily dictates appropriateness, and that's the personal taste of your client more so than yours. You have to defer to what the client wants. Conference rooms and lobbies, places where people don't necessarily spend all day, can be more dramatic because less time is spent there. They can have more intense color and bold patterns. But offices in a commercial application are a different story. Since people stay in an office for a long time, they generally work better in offices that are not too visually stunning. But even since I wrote this slide a couple years ago, less and less people are working in offices now, which is interesting. Number 3, restaurants may host a spectrum of color, but we have talked about pinks and red generally increase appetite, and blues tend to suppress appetite. I once had a pink dining room in one of our homes. It's not the dining room that's pictured here. I had pink upholstery and a light pink on the wall, and I found that people tended to linger in that dining room. I didn't necessarily notice that they had increased appetite, but it's a room that people like to stay in and just sit and visit a long time after dinner. Healthcare applications, number 4, should be more practical. So you want to avoid colors that denote death and blood. And those colors, of course, would be black, red, perhaps purple. So end users' opinions can be broad and varied, and back to your own clients, their desires may not fit into normal patterns of what we would be called market appropriateness. But again, you have to defer to what your client likes over what you like. Also in this lesson, we spent the second half talking about sustainable design. You watched a good video on that. We were taught that small shifts in our thinking, like not using plastic straws and having meat-free Mondays, for example, can all play into sustainability. And then we talked about how that fits into the fabric world. And most of us were surprised to learn that natural fibers have to go through many processes, washing and bleachings, before they become fabric. And the synthetics generally take less steps to process and to become recyclable. So that was a surprise to most of us from that video. Also, keeping natural fibers clean, it tends to be more difficult than keeping synthetics clean. That didn't used to always be the case, because a lot of our synthetics used to be polyester, which just used to hang on to grease and other stains. But that has certainly changed as the fabric world has developed all kinds of what's the word they're called? I'll think of it in a minute. The fabrics that are that work well, like a sunbrella outside. There's a name for them, but I can't think of it right now. That means that they're kind of performance. That's the word, performance fabrics. There's so many of them now that are synthetics that are much easier to clean than in the past. So we have to remember that those performance fabrics are often a good idea because they take less steps to work with than the natural fibers. Okay, so after that, we moved on to discussing fibers, actual fibers, natural fibers, and man-made fibers. So this just shows an image of some magnified silk fibers, and let's talk more about natural fibers and manufactured fibers. This is a chart that we referred to several times, and I asked you at the time to take a photo or a screenshot of this because we referred back to it in several weeks. So we learned the differences between natural fibers and manufactured fibers and broke the natural fibers into the two categories, cellulosic and protein. The manufactured fibers we broke down into regenerated and synthetic as part of that discussion. So let's quickly review the natural fibers. The cellulosic are the ones that come from plants. Okay, so seed, cotton comes from the seed from the fruit, actually, of the cotton plant. For examples, that's what we use in our t-shirts, our sheets, our jeans. And cotton absorbs water, so it dyes easily. It's just a great fabric to use if you need lots of great colors. We also have our stem or leaf plants that give us linen primarily, also bamboo and sisal, and those are called bast fibers. And we can use those in clothing, wall coverings, and upholstered items. And I told you that when one wears linen, one is generally stylishly wrinkled. It kind of comes with the territory of wearing linen. So there are other plant fabrics that can be woven into fabric. Grass can be woven into mats. Seagrass, raffia, rattan, and cane are best used like in window treatments, such as blinds, screens, that sort of thing. Moving on to our natural fibers that come from protein or from animal sources. Wool, of course, is the most common. Other animal fibers would be mohair, alpaca, cashmere, pashmina. Silk, which is harvested from the cocoons of moths. So we talked about specifically how we get silk. You saw some videos about the silk actually being unwoven from the cocoon. So silk has been prized for centuries because of its elegant sheen, rich luster, and vibrant colors when dyed. But you might remember that I have the silk curtains that have not held the dye very well, unfortunately. Moving on to our synthetic fibers. First, we have manufactured fibers, or those that are regenerated from man-made fibers. Some are regenerated and can be used to make fabrics. We have glass, which is an inorganic manufactured fiber, and others would include layon, latex, acetate, bamboo, lyocell, which are made from synthetics, which are chemical compounds specifically developed as for use as fibers. Then we have our manufactured fibers. Our synthetics would be our polyester, nylon, acrylic. There are quite a few more, but here are just a few of them. So some fibers are made from natural materials that can be used to make fabric, but most are made from synthetics. So these are the synthetics that you're seeing on here, which are chemical compounds specifically developed for use in fibers. Our next lecture moved us into yarn, which is the linear material that is made into fabric. So let's look at yarn and how that plays into eventually becoming fabric. So filament yarns are individual strands of fibers, like a monofilament, like the nylon that goes in your toothbrush, or a fishing line would all be examples of filament yarns. And a video showed us how the yarn is spun, but another type of yarn is actually extruded, where liquid is forced through a small hole, producing a filament or an individual strand of fiber. So that's man-made or synthetic. So we talked again about a fishing line. I showed you a video illustrating how strong a fishing line can be. Here are some examples of spun yarns from natural or man-made fibers. They're actually spun as opposed to being a filament one. So here are some examples of a wool, silk, and cashmere. I can't see what the others are right now. We have a couple linen samples, and I'm showing you what it looks like when those spun yarns are actually pulled off of the finished textile, and then I've kind of unraveled them back to their natural state to show what they looked like before they were spun into the yarn. So spinning makes them substantially stronger, and we saw this as I pulled yarn from 4 scarves and showed how weak it got as I unwound the various strands. We learned about yarn ply, the number of fibers that are twisted together to make one yarn. We have single ply, double ply, triple ply. You could have, many plies of yarn. Generally, we have a double or a triple ply. And we looked at some samples of that, untwisted them, and to see what actually ply means. We learned about Z-twist and S-twist. On the left, we have an example of Z-twist. On the right, we have an S-twist. And we looked at some samples to determine if they were S or Z twist yarns. We then talked about fabric structure, how cloth is actually made. So we start out with the fibers, and the fibers are spun or made into yarns, and then they are woven or knit into what is called fabric structure, and then we actually have the fabric. So fabric structure, we talked about the way that cloth was actually made, and it's the most common way to identify material. And the term refers to the way the yarns or fibers are held together. We looked at some beautiful samples of early Renaissance tapestries and talked about how tapestries developed through the years and the appeal of tapestries in the early years. Certainly they were only used by the very, very wealthy with limited colors and strong contrast. There wasn't linear perspective, though this early Renaissance period was the most notable tapestry period. They were portable. We learned how they insulated some of those very, very cold walls in castles and palaces, and they were used as an excellent means to produce or to communicate propaganda. And I showed you several examples of amazing tapestries from around the world. So fabric structure, we can break it down into 2 main types. Fabric can either be woven, which you did on your weaving cards near the end of the semester, or actually during the beginning of the semester in week 3 you did your weaving cards, or it can be knit together where the yarns are actually looped together. So those are the 2 main types of fabric structure. We learned about weaving components and what it looks like actually on a loom. We talked a fair amount about a loom with the warp threads, the weft threads, and how those are used on a loom. And then you made your weaving cards. You showed us a basic plain weave with approximately the same number of warp and weft filling yarns. We looked at examples of all of these in our swatch books. You learned a basket weave by doing a 2x2 or a 4x4, where 2 or more warp yarns pass over and under 2 or more filling yarns, and you did that on your weaving cards. You also learned about a basic weave, which is a twill, which is similar to herringbone. As you recall, you did the twill card, and then you found out if you just turned a corner at one point, you got a herringbone, which is actually named over the bones of fish that go in this manner. We learned about satin weaves that are very, very similar to sateen weaves. They're just the opposite of each other. So those are the 6 basic weaves. We also talked about some more complicated weaves, but those are the 6 basic that you need to understand. Okay, and then after we talked about fabric structure, how it comes together and the weaving it, we talked about the actual textiles themselves. And I showed you many, many beautiful examples of textiles. We focus on their appearance, not as much about their structure. And so I showed you some just gorgeous fabrics. I love the appearance of this particular silk. Anything with flowers, botanical prints are my favorites. So let's kind of review a little bit more about how a fabric looks. Fabric can have motifs on it, being the subject matter. There can have design styles that have a kind of look back to historic origins, or they can have a particular layout. So here's some examples of some very common motifs. Almost anything's available. I mean, if you needed, I needed musical notes at one point, and I Googled that, was able to find that in an online fabric store. You can just find almost any motif you want, representing amusement parks, sports, teams, just about anything that you want to find. Halloween, Christmas images. I had to make a cat-themed quilt recently, so it was really easy to find cat fabric, and needed airplane fabric for my grandson's birthday, flip-flops for a particular quilt. Fabric design representing historic origin. We talked about some of these Japanese, these Georgian looks, these Art Deco, an African look, or a kind of an Italian look. So many different types of fabrics that kind of remind us of different cultures or styles. We can also categorize fabric design into how the motifs are arranged. So let's look at the way that some of these are arranged. Kind of spaced or packed, or designs that kind of meander around the fabric. So that's the layout. It's how the pattern itself is actually arranged on the fabric. All right, we also talked about fabric design. And you can see an example of a lot of different fabrics here, which would have been our conclusion after talking about all the different aspects of fabric. I need to plug in my computer. There we go. Good. I was afraid it might reset, and it did not. We're still continuing on with this lecture. So we concluded by talking about fabric design and all the different things that that could involve. We talked about the finishes on fabric, standard, aesthetic, functional, backing, and lamination. We don't need to review too much of that information. Standard sizing is added, then it's washed out along with the excess dyes. The aesthetic of a finish can be changed by having an embellishment added to it. A functional finish would be a soil repellent or wrinkle resistant finish being put onto it, or backing and lamination, a thin coated plastic coating could be put on the back to give it perhaps stability. Purposes of the finishes, they actually can change the appearance of the fabric. They can change the hand of the fabric. Remember what that is? It's how it actually feels in our hands when we just kind of hold the fabric in our hands. That is the hand of the fabric. The finishes can actually change the performance of the fabric as well, and we looked at many samples in the swatch kit. We also spent some time helping each of us decide what our own personal design style is. I thought that was a fun class where we looked at our design styles. I have different design styles that I've used in different homes. One of my kids told me that my design style was steak center chic, which I was a little bit offended. The house I just decorated for my husband's golf retreat in Rancho Mirage, California, I jokingly called the design of that leftovers, because I used all of the fabric or the furniture that we had in storage, but I pulled it all together with wallpapers and upholstery. So I think I made it look decent just as a style of leftovers. But some of you figured out that your design style is rustic. Others of you decided that your look is mostly traditional, and that's where mine comes in. Traditional can be kind of a dark wood look or a coastal beachy look, come under traditional. Some of you prefer modern, that includes a Scandinavian, very less is more, kind of a sparse look, a modern farmhouse that is less vintage than farmhouse and more linear, or kind of an industrial and minimalist look with lots of metal and wood, both under moderns. And most of you seem to have chosen, in most of my classes, most of you fit in the eclectic category, where you use elements from a lot of different eras. So I think that was a lot of fun to kind of discover our own design styles. We also talked about fabric performance, durability, color fastness, flammability. We looked at many different tests to see how fabric holds up under wear and tear, how well it maintains its color, whether it supports a flame when it is exposed to heat. We looked very closely at those with many tests that are done on your fabric. You also, I think it was week 8, you did your site visits and you showed examples of good and bad fabric choices in public spaces. Instead of holding class, you went kind of out into the open market to complete that assignment. We then moved on to dyeing methods, where we talked about different dyeing techniques, fiber dyeing, solution dyeing, and cross dyeing, and we looked at samples of those in our swatch kit to see what the differences are. We also looked at yarn dyeing, peace dyeing and resist dyeing. So we won't look at those in our swatch kit again at this moment. Then we learned about common printing methods by watching a video. We also discussed this in class: direct roller printing, discharge, screen print, burned out printing, heat transfer, and digital printing. We watched a brief video that showed how a lot of those are done. We talked about the differences between dyeing and printing. Dyeing is when the fabric, the yarn, or the fiber is immersed in and saturated with a solution that completely colors the fabric, whereas printing, you're adding a design onto the top of the fabric. Coloring agents are applied to specific areas of the surface of the fabric to create those patterns or motifs. So the difference between dyeing and printing. Then fabric application. In one class, we talked about seating upholstery and window coverings. And then in the next class, we talked about wall coverings, panel systems, floor coverings, and fiber-based art. We learned that fabric is hardly ever used just as fabric. It almost always becomes part of something else, right? We upholster furniture in it, or we hang it on the walls, or we make curtains. Then, this was a video that I decided not to use. Broomstick and Fields in New York City. I have not visited this showroom, but it's on my bucket list, and I'll make sure that the next time I'm in New York, I do go in and see this showroom. It's just beautifully put together. Even if you're not a big fan of traditional furniture and design, I think you'll agree that it was put together quite beautifully with all those gorgeous and fully furnished rooms, and worth your visit if you get a chance to do that. And you're going to have to come up with some fabrics to meet their needs. You're going to have to look at specifically what they're asking for in durability and color. You're going to have to meet some fire codes and decide whether or not they need after treatments, things such as that. Mrs. Moneybags, for example, has a husband that occasionally likes to smoke in the house. That's a consideration she has to keep in mind. Dr. Oliver has kids that like to drink, a nurse that likes to give the patients Kool-Aid, so you've got to kind of work around that. Mr. Jones has some unique requests for his motel cornice boxes in Nebraska. And if you don't know what a cornice box is, you might have to